I remember that.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
interesting. Interesting stuff.
I mean, he's a lib, of course, but it's still strong work. And
What do you have against the libs, Curtis Yarvin?
some of my best friends are libs. I grew up as a lib. The libs are my people. What could I possibly have against the libs? What are you even talking about? I love the libs.
Charles in charge of our days and our nights. Charles in charge of our wrongs and our rights. And I see, I want Charles in charge of me.
Are we recording yet? Are we live? Are we live?
We're not live, but I was just going to cut in because we're wrapping already.
Sure.
But did you want to talk
Sure.
before we talk?
No. It's
Okay.
fine. It's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine. We can be live.
Because the podcast we did earlier this year was my number one podcast. So thank you very much for showing up on my channel.
Awesome.
Did great numbers for me.
Awesome.
And
Cool.
I've been listening to there's a YouTuber, Skeptical Waves, who's stockpiling a bunch of kind of dissident opinions through Amazon voice technology. He's got probably about 50 to 75% of unqualified reservations in audio format now. So I've been listening to
Cool.
Dawkins Got Pwned on repeat, and the letter to the open-minded progressives on repeat.
Yeah.
What? It seems like at some point you started to think differently than you did before this point. So at some point you admit to being liberal or universalist.
I grew up as basically a classic blue stater, right? So really, and then I was a Cold War diplomat's kid, right? So I got that kind of, Cold War diplomat perspective.
But when did this weird worm start to itch the back of your brain?
Well, that's a good question. So, I'd sort of taken a long sabbatical to do some computer science research, and I was kind of a late libertarian maybe at the time, like Glenn Reynolds, Instapundit, like the early blogosphere. You remember that period? Like, he still blogs. He's the blog father. He's the law professor at the University of Tennessee or something like that. Generally, a good guy, and that was sort of the kind of like son of moderate, sort of almost like early.
So is this live and let live, don't tread on me kind of stuff?
No, that's much lower brow. This is like highbrow intellectual conservatism. These are like law professors, right? These are, Eugene Volokh, maybe kind of like the Reason crowd, and so you have this kind of light, libertarianism era stuff. And sort of two things changed while I was an unemployed computer science researcher, or independent researcher, or just like a crank or a weirdo, which, is really the way many still see me, of course. And so I'm like looking into this stuff, and I'm doing my like computer science stuff, but I'm also getting into like the harder stuff, like, like more, once you're into like libertarianism, it's like there's sort of a gateway drug kind of effect where it's like you read Hayek, and then you don't realize that you think of like Hayek as like the hard stuff, and then it's like, no, actually Mises is the hard stuff, right? Like Hayek was a student of Mises. Like, Hayek is like an inferior like pop Mises, right? He's fine, he's great, he's Hayek, right? But it's like Mises who's the real fucking stud here, right? And so you're sort of getting deeper into this very, very heavy, early 20th century, like, post-Habsburg kind of shit. I mean, Mises, for example, actually, not only is he the amazing theorist, he like ran the Austrian economy. He was like the Alan Greenspan of like Austria for like 2 years, and he like solved the like German inflation. Like, this guy was a badass. He like washes up in New York after the Second War, like, and manages to find some people to like take care of him and even give him like a professorship, but he's like never part of anything. And then, beyond Mises, you have, of course, the great Rothbard, who basically founded modern libertarianism. Most libertarians haven't really read much Rothbard. And beyond Rothbard, you have the infamous HHH, Hans Hermann Hoppe, who runs the Property and Freedom Society. If you're really cool, you can be invited to his yearly seminars in Bodrum, Turkey. And he used to be an economics professor at UNLV for a while. So he ran this like weird extension of like the Austrian School of Economics. of UNLV of all places, kind of, a place I kind of think of more in like basketball like terms, right? But and sort of, this is what it means to sort of get into the harder stuff. And
what is hardening about it? Like, what's the
what
general...
is hardening about it? Yeah, so excellent question. So what's hardening about it is that you sort of generally sort of broaden your critiques. And so, the thing is that the Austrian school of economics kind of borders on the political in a sense, is that it implies this very kind of, what Austrians basically believe in is free markets in finance, as opposed to kind of what we have, which are these like weird hybrid systems where the government sets interest rates. And they, like, if you were to sum up market, Austrian economics, in like one term, it's like basically all financial signals should be done by the market, including interest rates across the yield curve. And like, that sounds like a really simple, obvious thing, but it's just like impossible to get there from here. And,
who would be setting interest rates? Just individual banks?
The market? No, the market. You would have the supply of money that, let's say, do you know what a yield curve is? It's the interest rates as a function of time. So basically, normally you have a yield curve that points upward and to the right, because it basically lending money for 30 years, meaning I'm not going to use this money for 30 years, is going to be basically more expensive than lending it. Like, even the thing is, there are more ways to use a longer term of production, because what you're really doing when you're lending for 30 years is you're saying, do something with this money that will take 30 years to pan out. Do something with this money, like invent like fusion reactors or something. Like, that's sort of the way that a system like this, or just say, hey, I'm going to retire in 30 years. I don't need this money till then. Right. And that sort of peer-to-peer lending model, which is sort of naturally, then you're just like, literally the interest rate is set by the supply and demand of borrowers versus lenders at every term. Does that make sense?
So every individual borrowing action has its own interest rate.
Has a corresponding lending action. And so you're making, of course, you're making these things fungible. You're saying my 30-year loan is just like your 30-year loan. You're making these things fungible in the market, but you're still setting interest rates by supply and demand. A good example of this is to say, suppose an asteroid is projected to hit the Earth and destroy it in the year 2030. Okay, suppose that I wanted to borrow money now and pay it back in 2031. Yeah. There should be essentially no market for this transaction, which means that there should be no interest rate at that term. Basically, I would have to pay back infinite dollars in 2031. And so the thing is, if the yield curve in that situation is set by the market, you'll see this like huge spike in it, because nobody wants to basically lend money and get paid back in 2031. In fact, what you have in the 20th century is this weird system where, because of sort of historical things that went on in banking. Wow, we are going in a weird, deep direction here, but we'll get out of this. Because of things that historically happened in banking, you got this system where the government tries to sort of have a gas pedal on the economy by fixing the price, which it can do as a currency issuer, fixing the price of short-term interest rates. And then this non-market signal has gradually turned into the present of like what we call quantitative easing. What that means is you're now going to fix prices across the yield curve.
Through interest rates.
Through setting interest rate and through buying and selling, buying back bonds. So when the Fed buys bonds, it's driving the price of bonds up, right? So in fact, if you can issue infinite dollars to buy bonds, which the Fed can do, you can really peg these interest rates. But that is not a market signal. And thus you basically have this system where macroeconomics depends on command economics in this really weird way, which everyone thinks is normal because that's the way we like normally do it, right? And in fact, I would argue it's a very strange, it's sort of the result of formalizing very dodgy banking procedures that are not healthy at all for the economy. Very deep digression. In any case, you're basically trying, understanding is sort of, and you won't really get this from Hayek. You'll get it from like Mises. And so, here's this sort of very deep existential critique about the way the world works, which is very, very interesting. And sort of, you're just like, wow, there's this area totally outside the Overton window, which is like here, this is like normal economic views. And then there's this like other porthole that's like way the heck over there. And so, what hardening means is sort of strengthening your ability to kind of jump outside the Overton window and be like, no, it's not just that actually you come to see the Overton window more as a bubble. And it's like actually, the cult of Overton, basically. And everything outside the bubble is sort of very small in your picture because that's the bad outworld. And everything inside the bubble is sort of inworld. And this is a bubble in time. Anybody who was born before, 1920 has perspectives that are outside the Overton window. So you've actually excluded basically all of history from your little bubble, which is exactly the sort of thing that a cult does. But
it's a really, really, really big cult. So it can.
It's a really, really big cult. Sure. But the thing is, cults can scale. So in any case, you start to get this strange feeling that you're living in a cult. Even when you basically read the Austrian critique of the way modern economies are planned, because that critique is an existential critique. It's basically, no, the whole idea of what it is to manage an economy here is just completely wrong. And that's why we have just like insane things like the business cycle, right? And just like what, right? And obviously the system is working as well as it could possibly work, right? Just from the results.
Totally.
No.
Nothing.
Totally. Right. Totally. Nothing could possibly be wrong with this thing. Nothing bad is happening. Nothing is fucked, right? And so you're just like, no, it's sort of possible for things to be fucked in such a way that the distance from where we are to something unfucked is unimaginable. It's not just something that would be politically very difficult. It's just existentially unimaginable within the existing political frame. And so you're starting to imagine that, less that you're on an island above a sea of chaos and more that you're in a bubble or a sea of evil, really. Like every cult wants to see itself as an island on a sea of evil, and everything outside of it, the past, 10,000 years, evil, 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 evil. Everywhere is evil except us. We, the people, we are not evil. This is a very human pattern. And so to find the present world, which has become this single integrated culture, to find that the single integrated culture is involved in this very normal human pattern is a very normal thing. It's like when you hear hoofbeats expect horses. This is a horse. A zebra would be like if this was the cult that had found like the meaning of life and time and everything. But like generally, the more genuinely enlightened periods tend to have more respect for other periods. And so this lack of respect for the world outside it is like a huge, like everyone but us sucks, is like a huge cult signal. Yeah. Right. And so you're starting to be like, I'm living in a cult. And the thing that Hoppe does, which is sort of really cool, is that he basically takes many of the unexamined sort of motivations and like understandings of economics and extends them in this book, Democracy, the God That Failed, into the political realm. And in particular, he sort of presents the old sort of theory of the law of nations and how governments worked before the democratic revolution in a way that you can actually parse if you've already been smoking that hard shit.
Okay.
Of like hard Austrian economics, like Mises and so forth. So, for example, one of the things that Hoppe points out is that what you really want in a regime is for that regime's own interests to be as aligned as possible with the interests of the nation itself. You want, what previous regimes called the solus populi supreme lex. The health of the people is the supreme law. In the sort of like, you can't say a regime is a good regime if its people deteriorates or if its land deteriorates. Like basically, preservation of capital. You start thinking about nations in the same way that you think about firms. And, as a libertarian, you're very, you understand the enormous power of this like system of competing firms. And you know that it breaks down when there's like a single firm, like a monopoly, that like monopolies kind of suck and are kind of more government-like than sort of networks of competing firms. And you're just like, wait a second, that's exactly what Orson Welles was talking about in The Third Man when he's like, makes the famous comparison between medieval Italy and medieval Switzerland. If you know that line, where he's like, this is from The Third Man, which was, I believe, was a Graham Greene novel, but it has Orson Welles as the villain, and he ad-libs all his lines, and he ad-libs this great line where he's like, totally historical, by the way, where he's like, Switzerland had 500 years of peace. And what did they invent? The cuckoo clock. Medieval Italy was just wars, wars, and wars. And, everything we have came from them. Something like that, right? Which is, perfectly true. Switzerland had some, had some things. But, in any case, basically, these very productive periods, these very functional periods in history come out of these like city-state periods with many competing players in a very dynamic market. And that's exactly where you also see the healthiest work of capitalism being done. When capitalism degenerates into monopoly capitalism, it actually kind of sucks. And so once you start to see this pattern of correlation between the state system and the corporate system, and you understand what makes the corporate system so darned effective, has also made states effective. How you can also see a state, a regime, as essentially a corporation which owns sort of the land and the people of the nation. And you can go from there to reading. You're like, okay, if states are like corporations, then a traditional hereditary monarchy is kind of like a family-owned corporation. And so the thing about a family-owned corporation is that the time interests of the family can be actually measured in the centuries. The owners of this property can think about, hey, wow, this is the legacy that we want to leave our descendants in the next century. A dictator who's going to, a president for life can't do that, right? And in fact, one of the ironies of our present situation is what is the most when you include both government agencies and private corporations and all other organized forms of structure. Yeah. What is the most prestigious organization in the world?
I know the answer, but maybe it's changed. It would be whoever tells the story, whoever directs the narrative.
Yes,
and whoever trains,
and that would be, in other words, the New York Times. And are you no huge quarrel with that? And suppose you were a Nazi. I know it's a stretch. Suppose you were a Nazi and you were trying to take over the world. Yeah. You got to infiltrate your personnel. You got to put a little chip in the brains of like 100 people. Which people which would make them Nazis, and then they would conspire with the other Nazis to like Nazify everything? I would think that a substantial percentage of the people you chipped that way would be at the Times.
Well, but there's also Yale and Harvard. There's also the
yeah. So there's some relevance there.
But you would go to New York Times rather than.
I think that's sort upstream. Of more. That's more changeable. That's more upstream in a sense. I think that if the Times, let's say that the Times is the last American paper that still responds. Here's the irony: is that it's certainly arguably the Times. And what is the governance model of the Times?
Well, they just had a walkout this weekend. So we'll see.
They're a
But,
fifth generation hereditary monarchy.
yeah. Well, but to what degree do the owners
But
actually
Salzburgers,
impact?
I think that the Salzburgers are the last. First of all, I think the current Salzburger, Puff or Pinch or Poop or whatever his name is, they all have these nicknames, right? But he really is the fifth in line. I think the current Salzburger is, frankly, and I don't care who hears this, a weak king. I think that his level of control over the Times is weak compared to his ancestors. Someone like Bezos, who is the publisher of the Post, I think has zero influence over the news desk. But I wouldn't say that of the Salzburgers. I think Bezos doesn't own the Post, he sponsors it. But the Salzburgers are the last great American dynasty. Moreover, think about the irony of this world in which the most prestigious organization in the world is a hereditary absolute monarchy. Have you like no one has noticed that, right? And so you actually, like, when you start to try to understand this form of government and this system under which sort of the world was traditionally governed for the whole rest of the world outside the bubble until like the late 18th century, it's just like you're looking at the real world from inside the revolution. And the real world is actually not the world inside the bubble. That's a province of history. Sort of real history is outside it. Then we sort of observe things like, gee, wow, everything we like use or make or do is actually created by one of these little capitalistic monarchies. Your computer was made by Apple, which is a monarchy. It was actually made by Apple in China, so it was made by a monarchy in another monarchy. You send a package by FedEx, you're using a monarchy. You send a package by U.S. Postal Service, you're not using a monarchy. You're using, vote for who runs the U.S. Postal Service.
Yeah, but
it's not a democracy.
In,
so you're
in
using
America,
something else.
In the modern mind, we make a distinction between government and business. We have a hard time seeing that.
Right.
We say that the government's sovereign, and it has to be run differently.
Right. And the thing is, that's a creation. That's a very, understanding that as functional and that parallel as not relevant and like public versus private, that's a feature of the 20th century political narrative, which other centuries would have found often quite strange. And so you have basically sort of operating systems, which are like, I would say the difference in a sense, at the most, these are ways, first of all, these differences make even less sense, sort of public versus private, when, if I'm really a recovering libertarian. And so if I go up to a libertarian and I want to we should be nice libertarians. But if I want to mess with their heads, basically, one of the things that I'll do is that I will ask them what the two most successful engineering projects of all time were. And I will try to get them to answer first the Manhattan Project and second the Apollo Project. And I will ask them to admit that these things were successes, and then I will point out politely that they were government projects. Now, that's a very interesting analogy the more you look at it, setting aside the Apollo Project, which was actually the Nazi space program, as you probably know. Really, Nazis put an American on the moon. And the, literally, it's the same. Yeah,
Same people.
And it's the same people, right?
But the governing structure of those two projects was not
the way government works today. And so if we look at the Manhattan Project, which didn't involve any Nazis, and so it's much better to talk about. If we look at the Manhattan Project, which was what we see, especially from a Silicon Valley point of view, is we see a giant startup. We see something that runs like a startup, right down to having a technical and non-technical two-in-a-box CEO structure. We see that it runs completely from the top down. It doesn't have, and a lot of these companies, you'll find advanced technology labs or so forth, which kind of work like academia, where they just hire a bunch of people and have them do cool stuff that they want to do. There wasn't any of that in the Manhattan Project. There was no 20% time. in the Manhattan Project. No,
Is 20% time, is that a thing?
Like
that
a
you guys
Google,
do?
yeah,
Okay.
like that's a Google thing where you like do 20% of time on your own project. But really, if you're a first class person, researcher or anything, in the modern world, you've been doing only things that you wanted to do since you were 16 years old. The Manhattan Project took basically the best scientists of the 20th century and gave them jobs and told them what to do. That was insane. Moreover, it was a completely top-down military hierarchy. It ran like a monarchy, like a startup, like an Elon Musk company. And it was basically like everyone has their orders and they have a bunch of resources that work for them. And their job is to basically get the things that their orders say done using the resources that they have. This is the way people who have operated in anything non-sclerotic in the private sector expect organization to work. People who have operated in the public sector have a very different expectation. They have an expectation that everything will work by process and that governance at every level, if you are hired for a government job, your job, and I grew up basically inside the deep state. So, your job is a process and you perform functions that are specified by this process. You have a supervisor.
What do you mean by process? Like there's a bunch of
process, like your job involves not achieving an objective, but following a procedure. And if your job involves following a procedure, which is often, private, even certainly Tesla needs, process and procedure. But if imagine you're like, for example, a Customs and Border Patrol officer. Like you have a set of things. Your job is not to have the objective of keeping illegal aliens out of the country. Your job is to like handle these encounters in a proper way according to the proper process. And in theory, everything that you do is scripted.
And endless. It's an endless process.
And right. And you have a boss. And the purpose of your boss is essentially an exception handler. And as we say in the programming biz, and if your boss can't figure out what you should do in this situation, you call your boss. If he can't figure out what to do, he calls his boss. And that's sort of the basic structure of operations within the public sector. It's almost like a bureaucracy is sort of more like a court than like an army in some ways, where in a court, obviously everything functions according to procedures, everything, right? And even, eventually you have to make decisions, and decisions are done in a very scripted and structured way. And ideally they're done by multiple people rather than one person. And having any kind of personal authority is really anathema to any kind of bureaucratic or oligarchic system. And so
that's kind of like the meaning of you salute the uniform, not the man kind of thing. Like everybody's a suit.
Yeah, everybody's a suit. Everybody has a role to play, and moreover, when you get to the decision-making level of this hierarchy, what you see is that decisions are made by whoever's in the room, and whoever's in the room depends on this very inchoate thing, which is prestige. And prestige is a very nothing says we just admitted that either the New York Times or the New York Times and Harvard and Yale were the most powerful institutions in the country. Neither of them is mentioned in the Constitution. So if your real power structures are not mentioned in this piece of paper, then the piece of paper is no longer even about the government. It's like as valid and relevant as like the Articles of Confederation. It's not actually a description of how power works within the regime.
Yeah.
And that's a very sort of, these kinds of realizations would sort of drag you completely out of the frame of debating low taxes versus should we do something about global warming or whatever the fuck, right? These sort of rip you out of the frame. And that's kind of what I mean by kind of a harder edge to my understanding of political reality, where you suddenly start to see, oh wait, actually, the case for the revolution itself as a whole is basically that it won and not much else. And
the American Revolution.
So the whole revolutionary period of the Western world.
Even all the way back to the Reformation, all the way back to
sure. There's the thing is, there were many good things that came out of these periods in various ways, and every sort of historical period has its own genius. But when we basically imagine it as a sort of Gnostic progress toward a perfect future, then we start having to ask questions like, well, what would our ancestors think of us? Would they think that we had progressed? What would the city fathers of San Francisco in 1922 think of San Francisco in 2022? Take a moment to process that. Right. And so actually, when you sort of dig into history well enough that you actually understand 1922 to know well enough what 1922 would think of 2022, you suddenly get this weird parallax. And by the way, I picked 1922 because that was the original like copyright cutoff date. That was before then you can read every book ever published for free. So, where in the Overton window is the entire English language corpus of pre-1922 books located?
Google.
Yeah, I know. But where relative to the Overton window is it?
Oh, it's to the right, or what we describe as the right.
Or it's to the right is sort of inadequate. It like surrounds everything in a sphere that is much larger. The world outside the bubble is much bigger than the world inside the bubble.
Yes.
And that's what makes the bubble sort of provincial in a way. And once you sort of get outside, it's like when the first time people got into space and basically saw a picture of the whole Earth from space.
Yeah.
It's a huge stoner moment, late 60s, right? And like, the ability to see the bubble from outside the bubble and to be like, wow, I'm floating in space. I'm like a Habsburg stan. I see the whole bubble, and it's just like tiny and ridiculous. And you're just
was
like,
it disorienting to you or gleeful?
Oh, it's enormously disoriented. It's enormously disorienting. It's enormously disorienting and uncomfortable. You're going through a rabbit hole that in some ways you can never return from. I mean, really, like if you're like watching this interview and you're worried about going down, just don't. Like you could just reach up to the keyboard and turn this off right now. Well, and you will not go down the rabbit hole. And like
it seems to be knocking at the door, though. Again, you're Unqualified Reservations under Mitch's Mulbug. You were laying out things that I was trying to look for. You were giving explanations about why the woke thing and the hyper progressive thing was taking over. And now we have Elon Musk taking over Twitter, and MSNBC just this morning published something about how he's a dictator now, and he's
a dictator now.
He's a dictator. He's running everything.
I do not know Elon Musk. I have never met or communicated with Elon Musk. Okay, important for me to make that disclaimer.
The story of a central authority overtaking the marketplace of ideas and disturbing, very much so, the oligarchical structure, what you've called the cathedral, is it's showing that the rabbit hole's right here. There's something going on.
It's definitely, I mean, there was it's sort of very interesting. Of course, people knew abstractly that certain, essentially what was happening at Twitter is that Twitter had made a very, very sensible business decision of outlawing their trust and safety, which is a wonderful name, their trust and safety committee, to basically sort of the powers that be. And the powers that be sort of no longer in some ways have the gravitas to really pretend to the level of like Olympian independence that they once have. They actually seem to be like conniving in like a very obvious and sordid way. And so, but it's sort of like one of the things that these organs have benefited from is the deep instilled cultural respect of Americans for organs like the FBI. Mm-hmm. And so basically to an advanced progressive who realizes that the feared domestic, Gestapo of J. Edgar Hoover, is now realized that former Gestapo is now managed by people who are down with the program. And moreover, they can take advantage of many old traditional boomer Americans who like think about the G-men and John Dillinger or something. And so they're like, wow, actually everybody is totally fine with the idea of the FBI telling Twitter what to censor through basically someone like James Baker, the ex-FBI, through basically oligarchical prestige networks. And what you see in the memos from what you see, and that just seems like procedurally very proper to listen to the respectable authorities about what is and isn't or could be misinformation. I mean, what was ridiculous is that the whole like Twitter like hacked materials policy, like very important for society that people not be able to leak hacked materials. That was something that itself was come up with due to the DNC emails hack. So that was, and it was obviously nobody would have added that policy of like the Trump organization has emails.
No, it was an antibody specifically to preserve the cathedral or the
and yes, and nobody even like actually the theory that was even a Russian operation is completely, there's no public evidence for that. And so you have this basically, all of these procedures when you're inside them look like the perfectly normal, prestigious way to do things. And then when you're outside them, not outside the whole Overton window bubble, but outside the sort of, either the old like G-men bubble, or outside the like, Hillary Clinton bubble, you're basically like, wow, this seems a little bit like a third world country in which the intelligence agencies are like moderating the means of transporting opinion, right? It's like, if I think about it, it's like, I was talking to my dad, who was a diplomat, about the Hunter Biden thing. And he was just like, look, this is exactly the way it's done. Like when you're basically in a situation where all you need to avoid any kind of liability for corruption is to basically just like toss just a handkerchief over it and be like, no, that isn't an elephant under that handkerchief. What do you mean? Right. That's a handkerchief. There could be something under the handkerchief. Right. As long as nobody is asking the questions in a way that will be effective, you're just like, oh yeah, sure, I'll just send the money to your son.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and if somebody was actually investigating corruption, like the way, the U.S. does when it investigates U.S. corporations for bribing foreign officials, you can't evade prosecution for bribing foreign officials by putting their son on your board. You just can't. Like, that is just not a thing that is going to pass muster. That is not a thing that is going to like delude anyone for more than 15 seconds who is investigating that. That is not a defense. And so essentially what you have developed there, this oligarchy is getting so fat and so lazy that it basically starts acting like an African despot and just basically like lying and
making up rules as it goes along
and doing shit and doing it in almost plain sight. And it becomes basically, and from within it, that looks like the completely normal, sensible way to operate. When from within it, it still looks just like completely normal, and not even normal and right, but like bold to do what they did. And like
stunning and brave.
Stunning and brave. Right. So from inside the inner party, like you're at stunning and brave. And then from outside, it basically looks like, corrupt despotism.
And is that the case, that moral warp, because the system has selected people who behave in that way, or is there some sort of, like they're all huffing a gas or something?
It's definitely selected like a Tracy Flick class. If you know the famous movie Election, it's an early Alexander Payne movie.
Yeah,
super amazing movie with
Reese Witherspoon and Matthew Broderick.
Yeah. Amazing film. And really what you see is that all of these prestigious positions become positions that require you, even like technical professorships, become positions that require two things. One of them is like outward orthodoxy, and the other is basically kind of Tracy Flick network building skills. And you have to be much better than like you have to be like student government kids, right? And so
ingratiating constantly.
Yeah, you have a kind of student government mindset there. You have, I think what you see like in the Twitter executives is kind of if you put it in like high school terms, when you imagine like fascism, you're thinking like football team governance. And when you look at this, it's more like, drama kid meets student government. And does that ring true to you? Like, do you have a sense of like, the drama society occupied America?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's very literal. I mean, they're going around stealing people's women's purses and stuff. They're really attracted to petty
I love the Sam Brinton story.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
Like the system that selects for this, it seems like in previous interviews and perspectives and the writing that you've done, you're like, this is indefinite. This oligarchical thing can just go on forever, but it seems like it's rapidly decaying. Or maybe it's not, because nobody's there to check it. Like
no.
Nobody's going to take these Twitter files seriously that has any sort of power.
Yeah, in some ways it's stronger than ever, right? And it's like, actually the worst thing that was done was with the Hunter Biden laptop files, and it sort of typifies the like LARPy, idiotic Giuliani hair dye conservative. Those files, that whole laptop should have been up on BitTorrent, like approximately 20 minutes after it was discovered, right? And
just put it out there in the open.
Put it out there, and instead they're like, they're in this like weird Superman universe of journalism where they're like, no, we will get the brash reporter to report the story that breaks it wide open in the New York Post and maybe the Washington Times. I'm sorry, did I say no? I meant the New York Post. And so they basically, like, these aren't institutions of the cathedral. They're not real. Like, you can't just have a like font that makes you look like a newspaper and call yourself a newspaper. That's like calling yourself a Hell's Angel, right? And no, you're not.
So even though these people don't have actual prestige, they're still coded in it. And the entire system, the Polygon, whatever it is, it's just coded in prestige. So there's nothing outside of it that can intrude order upon it.
No. How would anything gain sort of prestige? They basically think of, it's like there's no way the New York Post could become the New York Times. Like, first of all, what makes the New York Times the New York Times is not only its prestige, but its connections. And the New York Times basically, the business of the New York Times, at least in the side that covers government, is basically to steal information from the government and sell it.
Yeah, I don't know which essay, but this is a very important point that you make.
It's a point that I make in my earlier works. Yeah, and you're basically stealing through sources and leaks, which are like officially not legal or not allowed, but in fact are like winked at. This is a large stratum of sort of tolerated illegality. And whenever you're looking for real power, look for tolerated illegality and you will find it. And if like the President Trump had like death squads that would go and kill his opponents and not a word was said about it, that would be tolerated illegality. Right. And I don't think anything of that like that is going on, but I definitely know that if you open the New York Times, you will see stories based on non-public information basically across the front page at all times. In fact, one cute reform that I once proposed was to apply, there's a financial market thing called regulation full disclosure. It's very, where it says, hey, if you're corporate management, you can't like slip little hints to analysts. You got to tell all material non-public information at the same time to everyone. If you did that, the press as we know it could no longer exist because it attains its prestige. Its prestige comes from its power, and its power generates its prestige. And this works by basically its power is sticky because it generates networks of sources who are basically stealing information and selling it, who are therefore sticky. And so, in fact, it's like it's a watchdog who no one is watching. And the watchdog has grown very old and fat. Who reports on the press? Who the New York Times bitches about the press, but like essentially, this organization is so far above any power on earth, it's not even funny. And so
is Elon an actual threat? Is the acquisition of Twitter an actual threat in your mind? Or are they just acting like it?
I think usually they're just acting like it. I think in this case, I would say I probably hope that it's an actual threat, but I wouldn't want to be too hopeful. I think it would be very easy to be too hopeful. And I think that it's very...
So worst case scenario is nothing happens, but best or moderately good scenario, what would those look like? Like a challenge to this.
Okay, like a best case scenario is that Twitter becomes basically the center of a new prestige network.
Okay.
And so it creates an objectively higher quality, not just of aggregate unfiltered information, but of filtered information, which perhaps it itself takes the responsibility of filtering. And it says, by whatever means necessary, both by crowdsourcing and by curating. And I think that both of those things are absolutely essential in any kind of truth machine.
Okay.
If Twitter can establish that it can use its vast sort of army of like disordered opinion and content to actually forge a reliable source, which is actually more reliable than the reliable sources we have. Yeah. So, for example, if you go to Wikipedia, you will say, where does the information from Wikipedia come from, Ben? And the answer will be that it comes from reliable sources. And if you go to their page, which defines a reliable source, you'll find something very interesting and unusual, but in a way non-surprising, which is, what is a reliable source, Ben? What you might well ask. What you will find is that a reliable source is a source which is reliable. And that's and that's basically as far as we get, right? And so you have this very neat thing where you're just like, you're tracing the stream of power to its source, because anyone who could say what was true or not true, who could control, for example, Wikipedia, would be a very powerful person. Suppose they were Nazis. And the thing is, even if under the present Wikipedia policy, even if Wikipedia is controlled by liberal nerds, very liberal, very nerdy, very Aspergery, very strict with standards and policies. Mm-hmm. If Nazis were to take over the New York Times and all other reliable sources, say at once with like a lot of these chips, you need a lot of chips, obviously, Wikipedia editors would have no choice but to turn Wikipedia Nazi. That would happen. And so not only would it become Nazi content, all content would become tilted toward the Nazis. Mm-hmm. Sort of facts favorable to the Allies would be obscured. Mm-hmm. You might see in biographies of living persons a note of Aryan descent and so forth. Nazi ideas and ideologies would inevitably become embedded in the very structure of Wikipedia.
Through this thing called reliability, which is another word for prestige.
Through this thing called reliability, which is another word for prestige. And so this question of what prestige means and where it comes from is a very interesting question. You can short circuit that a little bit and not take this like deep dive into like outside the bubble, chaotic, ideological outer space. You should take the red pill, but you can take the blue pill, and like you can go a long way with the blue pill. Like I don't think Morpheus made a really strong case for the blue pill, right? With the blue pill, like you can really do your best, and so like even within this world, you can say, okay, I guess the reliable sources aren't very reliable. It's sort of like effective altruism, where we're like, oh, there's a lot of people who claim to be philanthropists, but I guess they're not very effective. I don't know why, but like they're not very effective. So let's do it again, right? And that's sort of the content on that was effective altruism.
Do you remember when you wrote a screed on?
It was a couple of months ago. It was before the fall of FDX. Yeah, it was fun. And the
do you get a thrill off of seeing your kind of your thought like manifest in the real world in these really big ways? No.
What would be the purpose of such a thrill? Like, first of all, and secondly, like I don't think it's really manifested very much. Okay. I mean, it's certainly not manifested anywhere near as much as it should. But I just have because I'm outside. I have outside the bubble standards for like what it means to manifest. Okay, I guess I would say. Okay. Right,
but back to Twitter. creating some sort of
Yeah,
prestige network that would be based around individual content creators working in unison somehow.
Somehow you want to basically, against the sort of strange force of oligarchy and the reliable sources, you need to synthesize the team of a team of central organization, of monarchical organization with democratic volume. And so Twitter, again, democratic with a small t, demotic, like mass volume. Twitter has enormous scale. The truth about anything can be found on Twitter, almost certainly. But assembling that truth, curating that truth in a way that is actually true, and not just truer than the New York Times, much truer than the New York Times.
But
And
it still has to be sticky too. You still need like what you're saying about power and prestige. The story itself, the storyteller or the storytelling has to gravitate or be gravitational, be a force that people want to believe in.
But the thing, yes, but people, do you know the thing that Henry Ford said, where he was like, if people had asked me if I built what people wanted, I would have built a faster horse.
Yeah.
And so, the thing is, what people think they want, and what they actually want are perhaps slightly different things. Mm-hmm. And so, there's like a sort of, there's a male way, there's a way when, as someone once said, the public is a woman. And so sort of any conversation with the public is in a way a kind of seduction. And so you have to get the public who is a woman to follow you, but you do not necessarily do this by doing what the woman wants you to do or tells you she wants you to do. And the thing is that irrespective of how you present yourself, if you create a network of quality that is much higher than the existing network of quality sources and much more reliable, people will simply see that. And to the extent that people will, that your quality is so much higher that people will simply see that, you actually don't need to recruit. You don't need to go out and start texting women like the size of your member. You should just walk down the street knowing that you're well hung and not even look at the ladies, and they will start following you as if you were the Piper. Okay. Right. And so
describe this Ude quality then. What is quality? What do you mean by quality?
Quality simply means being right. So I think of, they say the news is the first draft of history, and this is often taken as an excuse for just lying. Basically, they're like, "Well, it's just the first draft," we'll have a copy editor come and look at it later. Of course, nobody comes and looks at it later, right? It's sort of when you basically say we are going to treat the story of the present as the highest quality of history, then we need to subject it to the highest standards of history. The couple of the summation, or the summation of the standard of history by the inventor of modern history, Leopold von Ranke, who was not a Nazi tank commander, although he sounds like one. He was a very respectable Prussian. And Leopold von Ranke described his standard of history as, I'm going to butcher the German, so I won't even say it, as it really was. Meaning that if you're describing history, the history of anything, it should feel to a person who is really there, like the story of the things that really happened to them. When you set that against the, what was it, the Michael Crichton line, it was named after this physicist, the Gell-Mann effect, where you basically you read a story in the paper about something you know about, and you're just like, oh my god, this is ridiculous, and then you read the rest of the stories in the paper which you don't know anything about, and you believe them completely, right? And so if the Gell-Mann effect is happening with your reliable sources, then there may be a problem with your reliable sources, so again, there's a sort of huge market space to basically seize the high ground in the way that Adolf Ox did when he was founding the sort of the present dynasty of the New York Times, and basically say, actually, we are going to produce and curate, which is intensely hard and people are intensely distrustful of. We are going to curate the highest quality information around. And like, that's like saying, like, you're competing with the New York Times at that point. You're saying, no, actually, this is all the news that's fit to print. And, like, you thought that this could only be done by weird secretive organizations based in New York City that were founded, in the 1840s. But actually, we can do it too. And we can do it better. And that's a very, like, to be able to say that in some way, to whatever extent that's, whether that truth is 100% curated or 100% crowdsourced does not really matter. It's probably going to be, to the best you could do at that will probably be some mix of those things. And the only thing that matters is, can you just be like palpably truer? And that, that sort of quality like has a feeling all its own. It's like when you've never seen something above a certain quality bar, you can't picture that there are things of a higher quality. It's like I had this weird foreign brat upbringing, and as a kid I came back to the States from Nicosia, Cyprus, and I was a 12-year-old sophomore in a public high school in Maryland. And needless to say, I had some trouble adapting. And one of the things that I decided to do to adapt was to get a boombox and start listening to top 40 radio.
Okay.
This was 1986. And Bon Jovi was the thing, right? So, I was listening. Bon Jovi has some good tracks. You're a John Jovi fan, slippery when wet. I'm a cowboy on a steel horse I ride. I'm wanted, dead or alive. You can say things for John Bon Jovi. He's still around today. But one day for like a contest or something, the station like Q105 or whatever played a Rolling Stones song. And I was like, okay. That's what rock and roll is. And after that, like, Bon Jovi could never be the same. And so, like, the thing is, when you're hitting a higher level than people expect, you're delivering a product that motherfuckers didn't even think could exist. Okay, this is like the way to seduce the public. And it's also just a benefit to humanity, because basically you're replacing lies with the truth. And the impact of that truth may be considerable, but with regard to what you're saying about the New York Times having insider, it has, and it can go into the state and reveal things that the state wants revealed, but can't reveal itself. And so you'd have to, how would Twitter replicate that insiderness with regard to the government, or would it? That's an excellent question. Well, it would have to recruit insiders, and the insiders that it recruited would probably be motivated in different ways than the current insiders that the Times recruits.
Okay.
And so, when you look at the golden age of espionage, there was an acronym for what are the ways in which we obtain information from within a hostile organization, and the acronym is MICE. And MICE stands for money, ideology, compromise, and ego. And so ego, in the broadest sense, the systematization of the present source model is so extreme that it's almost like barely falls under espionage in any sense. But, the source here is clearly ego. So money, compromise, meaning blackmail, ideology, and ego. And so what you're looking at, if you're basically you're looking at a different kind of ego. You basically, people who became sources in this sense would be motivated primarily by ideology and ego. And so, for example, the closest thing to this today, which has only been unleashed on the tech industry itself, there's an app called Blind, which basically allows Google employees to talk behind Google's back, knowing that they're talking only to other Google employees. That's an infiltration tactic. As like an intelligence maneuver. That's like, imagine all the communists in the State Department in 1942 had a signal chat. In which
thank you for saying 1942, because I was just going to say, what's the difference between the two things at this point?
Yeah, the difference between now and 1942 is that in 1942 there were non-communists in the State Department. But I think there's still some, but they're not organized, right? They could be organized, and that would be a different and interesting thing. That would produce, there are a lot of, that is sort of one source of like higher quality information than is currently made public today. Is that basically because the leaking sort of function has become very stylized and very ideologically dominated. And of course, there's a huge quid pro quo because you're telling journalists what they want to hear, right? And, so much of this leak is, like basically the journalists who like cover CIA or cover the FBI are almost the next thing to CIA or FBI staffers. Right. So it's like if you think of the New York Times as a government agency, call it the Ministry of Information. Yeah. You realize that the Ministry of Information, it makes perfect sense that MOI staff would have access to all information within the system. Mm-hmm. And it makes perfect sense that the MOI would be the strongest ministry in the government. So basically, you've taken this important government function of controlling information, which we in the Anglo-American tradition mistakenly do not believe to be an important function of government. And we've outsourced it. We've hidden it. We've outsourced it to a place where it can't be attacked. We've sent it into networks which can't even be named or described, which cannot be displaced in any sense, and which seem to do a remarkably good job of incubating really bad ideas and making very bad ideas very prestigious. And basically, this is why this whole system needs to be peacefully and non-violently burned down. Or
liquidated. You can't erect an alternative system.
Well, yeah,
on Twitter.
Of course, yes. So in this, like, I'm of course talking about regime change in general, but of course, Elon Musk cannot arm the Twitter engineers and march them to DC to take over the Lower Potomac watershed, right? I don't think any combination of drugs would make that seem like a good idea in the morning, right? And so. You're limited to on the contrary, when you're a dissident, you should practice the most rigid possible compliance. You should be a very, very good friend of law and order. And you should always comply with your enemy's demands at gunpoint. In fact, ideally, you should be so compliant that they never even point guns at you. And that's what you do when you're playing for the long game, right? And so it's perfectly legal and even meritorious for Twitter to create some truth mechanism which is truer than the New York Times. No one will perceive that as an attack. That's the opposite of January 6th. No, you're actually just doing what the system in a way tells you to do. You're just creating this hyper stimulus that's so strong that it actually starts directing the bees, even though you're not actually really the queen bee. And because there is such a gap in quality of truth, if you create your own bubble, which is a bubble of actual truth within the bubble of lies that sits within the scary chaotic void of history, then there's nothing harmful or illegal or about doing that. My God, it's the American way, right? It's just that once people start thinking of the New York Times as old-fashioned official truth, and your thing as the young up-and-coming cool thing that all the cool kids believe, you've replicated the same dynamic that leads to the fall of the Soviet Union. And it did not lead to the fall of the Soviet Union super quickly, but what happened was that the Soviet Union lost its young elites. It lost them to the West, It lost them to this alternative power, which itself we must concede was not entirely always up to good. But it lost them to like blue jeans and like vinyl records, printed on like X-rays and like stuff like that. It didn't lose them to like a tank assault across the folded gap. And so what you're actually doing when have you heard the term soft power?
You've mentioned it several times throughout your writing, but why don't you define
soft
it
power? Yes, it was defined by, I think, originally by a guy named Joseph Nye, who's a professor at Harvard, some shithole like that, and he basically defined it as the way the empire works. Soft power is the power of prestige, of connections. It is the power that comes from being highly respected in an almost like, strange formalized way. And being highly respected in something that is not actually an open prestige network in any sense, but is a weird structural back scratching mafia. That's sort of the way that oligarchies work. It's the way that what George Soros calls civil society works. And you've heard the term civil society.
That's what it meant.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
And so these kinds of networks of prestigious people who know what is right and have sort of approved opinions. And if those people still command the minds of the best and brightest young people, they will rule forever. When they lose that, grip, when they lose their sort of their own grip on the elites, what you get is again a sort of dynamic that's been a problem in Russia and many countries, across the 20th century, which is that you get a separation between the regime and the elites. The best and the coolest people become anti-government. And, the sort of the deeper and truer sense that that's in, the more danger there is to the state. And when you start developing like a counter elite in Russia in say 1900, praising the czar in like polite intellectual society was like praising Donald Trump. Like everybody who was cool, not only were they against the czar, their parents had been against the czar, probably their grandparents were against the czar, right? And you see the results they got. They were not good, right? They really should have stuck with the czar, but they didn't stick with the czar and they got what they got. And fortunately, my grandparents had kind of hightailed it over there before then. I mean, they were Jews; they were not involved. But they were Stalinists actually. But
what if they were praising something, not the czar, that was better than what they eventually got? Wouldn't you want that? If you want to overthrow a regime by capturing the cool kids, then you want you want to give them something better to feel cool about.
You want them to give them something better to feel cool about. And what the cool kids in Russia in 1985 felt cool about is, why can't we be like the West?
Yeah.
Now, it would turn out that the West had its own problems, but, in like East Berlin in 1985, why can't we be like the West is pretty compelling. And so there's nothing that cool kids right now can point at that's as simple to point at as, why can't we be like X?
Yeah.
And so in a way, sort of capturing that, like the highest high ground, because basically fashion always flows downward. Like people only admire people cooler than them. That's like a definition of fashion, right? And so when you basically find, if you're looking to capture as much power as possible, you want to go as high on that totem pole as possible, and then you want things to flow downward from them. You want that start with a cool. This is why Facebook took over the world. It took over the world because it didn't start with the whole world. It started at Harvard. Moreover, it started in the Porcellian at Harvard. So it basically started in the everywhere it went after that, it flowed downward. And that's the easy, natural way to flow. MySpace could not flow upward to the bike room of the Porcellian at Harvard. Not even the bike room, right? It could never even reach the bike room. But
what you're talking about now, this alternative, is not something that could take root in a Harvard bike room.
No. It would have to. Well, it would take root as basically only in a dissident sense. Trust me, there are plenty of dissidents inside these organizations. They're not well organized. They're not like those kind of people who just sort of just can't stomach the diet of nonsense and lies that is like the daily fodder of existence within the regime. Like, like people just have no choice. They just can't swallow it anymore. They want to vomit it up. And, to the extent that even, that the talent and capacity and information of those people can be organized in some sense, I just don't think it's that hard to do that much better than the powers that be, just in terms of quality. And the thing is that in terms of like, how does this quality turn into concrete revenue? Couldn't really tell you, but like I think it's worth the long-term investment. Mm-hmm. And so, the means by which saying that Twitter should become a truth machine is sort of like, Elon has certainly said similar things. It's sort of like believing that there should be self-driving cars. I also believe that there should be self-driving cars.
Do you think that self-driving truth is what Elon's after? Like truth that makes it sound.
I mean, well, the thing is, actually, I don't believe that self-driving truth is possible. I believe that actually truth, to the contrary, it needs to be driven. It's like you basically, in a sense, when you're talking about a truth machine, it's to say you're talking about journalism is the same as saying you're talking about religion. They're the same things. The purpose of religion is to lead the minds of the people. This is religion in the not the hippy dippy sense, but like real religion, right? And it turns out that if you're a Catholic, you basically believe that one man should lead the mind of all of Christendom. That's how it is. That's what
and then
believe.
you get stuck with Francis, and you're like, what the?
And then you get stuck with with a communist pope. But yeah, it all went wrong when they when the John the conclave of John the 22nd or whatever, John the 23rd I think, and I think that was the first communist pope, I believe. But we're getting into obscure, the Cardinal Siri hypothesis. These are very, very obscure details.
This is not a part of your red pill moment.
Catholic doctrine. Yeah, no. This is very
different
dark
island,
stuff, folks. Don't get into this like sedevacantist material. But that's from sede vacante, meaning the throne is vacant. But you see that some Catholics have an answer for even your very astute question here. But so my belief, which is probably different from Elon's, because I just don't know if he's as much of a monarchist as I am, even though he's a working king, and
he's a practicing monarch.
So. He's a practicing monarch, but the thing is, many monarchs have practiced without really a full ideology of monarchism, and I think that's a mistake. Frankly, I think that basically, when you try to do monarchy without being a monarchist, especially when you try to do 100% monarchy without being 100% monarchist, you make mistakes like keeping the former general counsel of the FBI on your staff, right?
Yeah, okay.
I mean, like, this is a howler, man, and it's a howler. And so to me,
the word that defines monarchy is absolute power.
Yeah, right. To the extent that monarchy is not absolute, it's not monarchy. And so the sense of like, basically, it appears basically Jack Dorsey, like many kings, was ready to cede this sort of very important piece of power that affected not just Twitter but the outside world to this like little cabal of Grindr researchers, I guess, right? But the former head of trust and safety literally wrote his PhD on underage access to Grindr, and it's a subject that we can debate, right? Ephebophilia versus pedophilia. We could be here all day, right? We could invite Milo Yiannopoulos on to talk with us, but like, it's not necessarily the like territory that I want to think of in terms of like trust and safety. It's like, if Elon were to hire like, Richard Spencer as the head of trust and safety, he would be like, well, they put in Nazis. It's like, he's a former Nazi. He's a reformer. He's no longer a Nazi. Yeah. He's actually, he's very woke on the Ukraine question, it would be, it's just like, I don't think he'd frankly go there. I mean, he has a PhD in history,
I don't understand why they would put somebody in that
No,
key of a position.
because
It's just so weird that this
because you're just
that's how
not
it's
thinking
selected.
in those terms. You're not thinking in those terms at all.
Of ethics
You're
and
just like,
morality
no,
and what's
no,
good and
no,
bad
no,
and
no. My God,
child
like judging a
safety.
person for that reason, no.
Oh,
It was
okay.
just like it's not consistent with like prestige thinking. The idea, for example, that you would cancel someone at like a prestigious institution of learning for having having
Certain sexual predilections, but
yeah,
other
right,
ones are
right.
off, like heterosexual predilections that are randy.
Yeah,
They'll
well,
get you canceled.
yeah, but that's I mean that's the patriarchal sexual protections. That's like
Okay.
full on Handmaid's Tale stuff. No, we wouldn't want any of that, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like when you inhabit this world, it's like inhabiting any world. It's like being a Mormon, right? If you're just a Mormon and you grew up among Mormons, are you a Mormon by any chance?
No,
You kind of
no.
a Mormon face. You
Do
have
I?
a bit of Mormon face, a little bit.
Thank you.
And you know what I mean by Mormon face? It's not gay face, but it's like like the third cousin of gay face, right? You know what I'm talking about. Imagine yourself with a little nameplate. This is Elder Boys.
I've never been that strongly backhanded in my own interview before. Thank you. It was an honor. It was a great honor.
It's a compliment. I love Mormons. They're the best people in the world. Very moral. But the thing is, if you're like brought up a Mormon, like believing like in like the story of the golden plates or whatever,
Yeah.
right? And maybe you're like out there looking for the golden plates with like metal detectors or something, And do people do that? I don't know. But
I don't think they're corporal anymore, don't they?
Really? Oh, okay.
Translate
Yeah.
into
See,
some
maybe
sort of
you are,
bond or
maybe-
something like that. They're off the gold standard
must-
now, those Mormons.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe you were a Mormon, but in any case, basically, you're brought up within this weird science fiction novel that Joseph Smith wrote in the 1840s or whatever,
Yeah.
and like brilliant work. I don't know, that's like Bible tier, but like and you just like you feel that as normal, and that's sort of what it's like to grow up in the like progressive world, the like 20th to 20th century 21st century progressive bubble, which is basically like the blue state world that I grew up with.
Yeah.
That I grew up in. I mean,
Okay,
you asked me what I have against the libs, like these are my people, man. And so, actually to like sort of take the journey of like stepping outside the society to even understand like Mormonism is just like one among many possible religions equivalent to like Zoroastrianism or Hinduism is just like a huge mental frame breaking step.
Yeah.
And it's like DMT tier. And
What about the cultural critique? You don't concentrate on this too much because you're talking about process, you're talking about power, you're talking about these structures, but why are they the way they are? Why is this Marxist oppression theory kind of this
because
fighting the man kind of morality?
This is a core, this is a topic that I've really struggled to articulate in a way that is really comprehensible in mass. It's because, the term marketplace of ideas.
Yeah.
So when we think of a marketplace of ideas, we think of an evolutionary process in which successful ideas achieve market success and are rewarded by like successful reproduction. They go into textbooks. People realized, for example, in the early 1960s that plate tectonics was true. For the first half of the 20th century, plate tectonics, they're like, wow, it looks like South Africa kind of fits the coast of, South America or Africa. Like, wow, gee, a 4-year-old could notice that. Like, it's like retarded for like thinking that that's like a real thing, right? And then in the early 60s, people are like, no, that actually happened, right? And that's the way science is supposed to work. Basically, a better theory of how the continents got where they are basically replaced the old theory, causing the old theory to in fact be scene, which had previously been a main theory, it now becomes literally like crackpottery.
Well,
It becomes like
forgotten. I don't even know the counter.
Yeah, orogeny, right? Yeah, sure. But if you pick up like a geology book from the 1950s, it will explain how mountains are formed.
Oh.
And its explanation of how mountains are formed has nothing to do with reality. It's crackpot science, right? And those effects may exist like marginally, but plate tectonics are the real reason that mountains are formed.
Yeah.
And so you have this thing that it is the way the marketplace of ideas is supposed to work, in which good ideas beat up bad ideas. And this is all well and good.
Yeah.
But
good and bad don't have to do with true. False
right.
Alone.
Successful and unsuccessful. The problem is that somebody noticed that this marketplace of ideas worked so well that they should hook it up to power.
Oh.
And they should actually put it in charge. The problem is, once they did this, the criteria for success in the marketplace of ideas changed. And instead of power going solely down from the marketplace of ideas into the organs of execution, power came back up the pipe and contaminated the marketplace of ideas. There was no way to put a valve on it. And because there was no way to put a valve on it, suddenly what started to happen is that ideas that felt powerful, that felt relevant, that made an impact, started to gain a Darwinian advantage in the marketplace of ideas. Yeah. And when you look at sort of what constitutes a progressive idea, it's very strange. Sometimes they're like very for nationalism, sometimes they're for blood and soil. Sometimes they're against blood and soil. They did this weird turnaround with like the Ukrainian Nazis, which is like funny as all get out, right? It was almost as funny as like the COVID mask turnaround. Like, why do these turnarounds happen? And these turnarounds happen because of underlying shifts in the adaptive landscape of ideas. Mm-hmm. And so essentially blood and soil nationalism, when it comes from some ancient First Nations tribe that collected shells on, the borders of San Francisco Bay, that's empowering. You can really, empathize with these people. Israeli nationalism, much more questionable. German nationalism, definitely not. Mm-hmm. And so, like, when you look at why some of these blood and soil things, like, what are you saying when you talk about, we're on occupied, tick-attack land, as I like to say here in California, I'm an occupied Habsburg land. And and true that, right? And actually the true name of the country that I'm in at the moment, New Spain.
New Spain? Oh, yeah.
Nueva España.
Yeah.
New Spain. Right. So I'm sitting here in occupied New Spain, and liberal occupied New Spain. And in case you didn't think the Mexican War was legit, right? And if you're saying, no, this isn't New Spain, you're like, the Mexican War was, then you also have to, if you defend the Monroe Doctrine and the Mexican War, then you can say, no, this isn't New Spain. But like, if you're really going to defend both of those things, the Monroe Doctrine, because the Monroe Doctrine is, of course, what prevents Spain from restoring order after the revolution in Mexico, which was caused by the Napoleonic Wars. And so basically after the Napoleonic Wars, England, using the U.S. as a satellite country, said to the Habsburgs of the Holy Alliance, oh, hey, you don't get your colonies back. That's what the Monroe Doctrine meant. And so that's what turned Nueva España, which was actually one of the most conservative parts of the Spanish Empire, into the country now known as Mexico. Of course, having been to Mexico, I must concede that it was a vast improvement, much more modern and clean. I'm just kidding. But actually, everything that works in Mexico was basically created either when it was Nueva España or under the evil dictator Porfirio Diaz.
NAFTA? You're not going to include NAFTA in that? No.
Yeah, we'll give NAFTA some credit. But really, the Porfiriato was the high point after after the fall of New Spain, but the fall of New Spain was a tragedy. But in any case, basically
you're describing
back up
power, but progressive power has a certain sort. It honors certain powers and not other powers.
It basically, it's progressive power has is an attraction to power which is fundamentally chaotic in nature. It likes to basically think about, for a more modern example than supporting the Mexican Revolution, think about the ways in which people support the Arab Spring or even support the war in the Ukraine. Nice work on both of those. You've gotten a lot of people killed, American TV audience. And what you always find is they're like, yeah, but we got them killed sticking up for the underdog.
Yeah.
You know, history is a Marvel movie. Like, you know, I will stand for, like, you know, we are the good guys in the Marvel movie. And I'm like, well, you got 250,000 people here killed here, 500 million there.
Yeah.
You know, but they're like, but where are the good guys in the Marvel movie? It's like a scene from Idiocracy, right? You know, and if you look at what people are supporting and why they're supporting it, they're supporting an underdog against an overdog.
Over and over and over again. That's the key.
Over and over again. And without their support, the underdog would not only would the underdog have no chance, the conflict would never even exist. So they go through, in some places, they've gone through this pattern of supporting an underdog, chaos revolution, the underdog emerges on top, you know, starts to restore order, new underdog, right? And so you just have these cycles of chaos and revolution over and over again, which appear like beautiful and romantic to Americans. And this is not a 20th century thing. Americans did this over the revolutions of 1848. They did this in the Russian Revolution, the Mexican Revolution. You know, there's this guy, you know, John Reed, who Warren Beatty portrayed in Reds, film very worth seeing. He's sort of the Typhoid Mary of early 20th century revolution, because he basically, after helping to burn Mexico down, he goes to Russia and helps burn Russia down. Very dashing, romantic young man.
Oh, wow.
Would fit in today perfectly at any party in Greenwich Village. And
so what's the origin of the underdog myth then? This sounds like an archetypal form.
It's
like
an archetype. Yeah, exactly. It's an archetypal form where basically two things are happening. One is, by supporting the underdog is becoming a tool in your mind of you. You are taking possession of this person by taking his side. You are becoming, in a sense, a kind of lord over him.
Yeah, yeah.
And so he becomes dependent on you for the, like, rebellious fire that, you know, he's like, you know, Nelson Mandela, right? You know, when you support Nelson Mandela becomes part of your right arm.
Yeah. Well, or a lot of the support of the 2020 Black Lives Matter from the white part of America was this really twisted kind of ownership of the black struggle and this authentication of their own morality through the burning of cities and the decimation of black
One sec,
property.
I got to send the text.
All right.
I got to get off the phone in about 10 minutes too.
Okay. It's a short one.
Yeah,
it's always short for you. How do we land this plane?
This has been fun. How do we land this plane then? So how do we land this plane?
Okay, I got it. So how would Elon insulate truth machine from power? How would you remove power from the truth making process?
See, that's actually very easy, because you're so outside power. You're in a situation where, by definition, you're starting out without any influence. And so if you can rid yourself of this sort of feeling, kind of reactive sense, actually the greatest danger for basically dissident sources of information is not to react against power, to just like sort of ignore it in a way. So imagine you're a historian writing a history of the Wars of the Roses. Okay, are you going to be a like Lancastrian historian? You know, if you're a Marxist historian writing about the Russian Revolution, like that's a take. But are there any Yorkist professors at, like, you know, University College London? How about Lancastrians? You know, all of Yale University is like a nest of Lancastrians. I don't think so. And so, you know, when you go back that far, you're able to achieve like historical detachment trivial. Advance a little bit forward, only like a century and a half, to the English Civil War.
Yeah.
There already you're taking political sides. And one of the so when you're looking to have a more Olympian perspective, it's the Olympian perspective, not the oppositional perspective that you're looking for. The perspective of like, I'm going to like complain about this or that.
Yeah.
That's bad karma. What you're looking for, if you're actually looking to create what the Chinese call the mandate of heaven, it's a quality. The Arabic word for this quality is baraka. You're trying to create kind of a gravitas, like a dignity, like a sense of like, which is a sense that, again, you see that sense cultivated very much in the New York Times. This is why they're like, their fact-checking processes have atrophied in some ways. But, I was the subject, like earlier this year, I was the subject of like a story in a Condé Nast magazine, right? And I will tell you, like, the work the fact-checkers did there was absolutely excellent. And I mean, the story was going to describe my girlfriend as a dominatrix, right? And my fiance, my now ex-fiance, sadly, but they were just, and she was, the fact checker was talking to my ex, and she was like, I could feel that something was not quite right about that description. And so, the thing is, it's easy to mock these systems for their structural failures. Actually, like, there's a lot of greatness inside them. There's a lot of things to be learned from these machines themselves. And so this
Olympian perspective isn't a view from nowhere. It's a view from somewhere.
It's a view, well, it's kind of a view from nowhere in that it's like, I think it's more of a view from nowhere, but that view from nowhere is also a view from everywhere. And so if there's a perspective that is not within the Olympian perspective is not sufficiently Olympian. It should be a no-brainer that everything the libs are right about, generally by accident, is included. But the thing is, actually, if you're looking at the marketplace of an idea which is both useful and right is going to do both powerful and right is going to do really, really well. Such ideas exist. Should our enemies have a monopoly on them? No. Should we be forced to be wrong when we encounter an idea of that class? Absolutely not. And so the sense of like capturing the high ground includes capturing that quality of a high ground and saying, oh, this is one of your favorite pet ideas. This idea is fine and good. Let's move on. We love it. We're all agreed. And you don't want to be, they have every capacity of noticing that 2 + 2 is 4. You don't want to be trapped into thinking that 2 + 2 is 5. That is a very, very, very common mistake that comes out of an oppositional complaining narrative that is not trying to go around and get above.
So don't be the underdog.
Powers that be.
Don't whipping
sort
boy,
of,
I guess.
Don't adopt that kind of mentality. First of all, because the only reason that underdogs win is that there's an even bigger overdog somewhere in the picture. You don't have that. Because you don't have that, don't play that game. You're just playing a stupid game, and all the prizes are stupid. And, because really those underdogs that like succeeded, it's like Libya, for example, reminds me of the unification of Italy by Garibaldi. If you've ever been to Italy, you might have heard the joke that actually he divided Africa. And if you've been to southern Italy in specific, and I'm not sure if Italians tell that joke, but they certainly once did. In any case, Garibaldi, with his like 300 red shirts bent on blood and soil, overthrows the Bourbons in Italy. How does he do this? Well, it's not just Garibaldi with 300 guys. It's also the British Navy. Patrolling offshore, right?
Yeah.
And this is very much like the Libyan experience. It wasn't the Libyan rebellion that overthrew Gaddafi, it was a bunch of Libyan militias plus the NATO Air Force, right? And so, to say that it was like a Libyan revolution rather than a NATO conquest with the aid of some local traders is like a hard definition. If you don't have the NATO Air Force, don't do it.
But if your enemy has the NATO, like if the cathedral has everything and you're trying to create something that's not,
don't be an underdog. Don't go for the underdog mentality. Everything about the underdog mentality is meretricious and will lead you only to disaster. Simply just create greatness as if your enemies did not exist at all, and they will not dare to even approach you.
Yeah. Speaking of creating greatness, plug your Substack, and then you can head off to your dinner plans. I hope it's a fancy feast.
My name is Curtis Yarvin. And you can find my Substack at graymirror.substack.com. That's Gray with an A, the American way.
Why gray?
Thank you so much.
Is this about gray journalism?
Why gray? Why gray? That's a good question. Yeah, that's an excellent point. It's like gray has a sort of almost an officious quality. I once said to someone who was founding, thinking of founding a media company. I was like, the purpose of your media company should become the state media organ of the next regime. And that's, of course, not my ambition. That's just a Substack.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, right.
But
we'll see.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Curtis.
You so much.
Have a good night.
Thank you so much. Great call. Take care. Bye.
Bye.